Okay, welcome everybody to session 7 of our partner training webcast series. I'm Steve Walsh. I'm the product manager for Notes Migrator for SharePoint at Quest. And this is our last session of our 7 session series. So today we're going to be talking about even more advanced content migration jobs. So we started talking about content migration in session 1 and then more in session 3, but we've added this additional session because we had so much to talk about in the area of content migration, which is of course the core area where our tool has been the leader for so many years. Reminder that we are using the Notes Migrator for SharePoint 6.1 beta version for these demos. And you can get that beta version if you want to. Today's content won't actually be using any new beta features, so everything I'm showing you today will just work with the release version. So we're going to be looking at document sets first, how to create document sets from notes documents and different options you have for migrating, multiple notes documents into one document set, or take one document set for each notes document and put all the parts in that document set, things like that. Then we're going to be looking at the various kinds of content pages you can use in SharePoint. Wiki pages and basic pages are kind of the fundamental types. Also, you have Webpart pages and publishing pages, which are more complex types of pages, which require a little bit more work in your migration. And we're also going to be talking about migrating to InfoPath form libraries. And so this is where we're actually generating XML InfoPath data documents and putting them in a form library. So this is different than the design migration pieces we showed you a couple weeks ago, where we were generating the design of an InfoPath form template, all the layout of the fields and all the look and feel of the form. That was the design migration piece. This is going to be the content migration piece. And so as you'll see, for the generating of InfoPath documents in a form library, it doesn't really matter whether we generated the form for you using those design migration features or whether you hand created your own InfoPath form. So the content migration and the design migration are sort of separate issues. And then finally, we'll end with an introduction to our SQL Server migration capabilities. And we won't be able to do a complete job here in the time allotted, but I wanted to give you a flavor for how the basics work. And I think that will cover most everyone's needs and get you pointed in the right direction if you need more information. So let's start with document sets. In SharePoint, a document set is really just a way for you to take multiple files in a document library and have them live together as one logical document. So you might have several Word documents that are all about one legal case, for example. You might want them to live together as one document set for that legal case. And SharePoint allows you to do some interesting things. This is a SharePoint 2010 feature, by the way, and you can do things like you can create a version of the entire document set together, and you can put a workflow on the entire document set. So it's a way to have multiple files live as one logical document. And it's similar to a folder in many ways in SharePoint, where a folder can have multiple files in it. Same thing as a document set can have multiple files. And in some ways, it kind of looks and feels like a folder, but there's additional functionality. You can have forms, custom forms for your header, and you can have detailed properties and things like that. So if you want to create a document set in a migration job, you would go into your target data definition and create a column of type document set. And you can just use a generic document set, or if you want to, you can use our document set template designer to load in a custom content type. So if you've created a custom content type for a document set, we can load that in, or we can just create the generic document set types. Once you've created your document set column in our target data definition, then you can simply map data to it. So we have the same column dot property name notation that I showed you before for Word documents and PDF documents and things like that. And so if you create a document set column called docset, then the properties would be docset.name, docset.description, and so on. And at a minimum, you need to map the name property. That becomes the name of your doc set in the document library. And you can also map additional columns for the various properties you have in your doc set. Now, if it's a standard doc set, that will just have two properties called name and description, but if you loaded in a custom doc set, that might have all sorts of other properties that you defined in that content type for your custom document set. And then inside that document set, any attachments that you have migrated in your migration job, anything that's mapped to a file column, will now get placed inside that document set unless you purposely put it to an alternate library or an alternate folder. And the same thing with generated documents. If you are generating Word documents or PDF documents, those would also become members of that document set. So you can imagine taking a notes document, mapping some of the properties for the document set, such as the name of the document set, from your notes document, and then taking all the attachments and images, and they become pieces inside the document set. Or you could even generate a PDF document from the rich text, and that also becomes something inside the document set. So some of the rules to keep in mind. Whatever you map to the name property does become the identifier for a unique document set. So by default, if you have two documents with the same subject field and you're mapping subject to the name property, they're going to get merged into the same document set. And sometimes that's exactly what you want. That gives you a lot of flexibility, so you can take a bunch of notes documents with the same identifier or the same category, whatever you want, and they're going to get automatically merged into one document set. But there's sometimes that's not what you want, and you're going to get some unexpected results. It may be just a coincidence that those documents have the same subject, and you don't really want them merged in the same document set. So we have a property you can set in your document set column that says unique by document ID, and that means we're going to use the internal notes identifier to control the uniqueness of a document set. So if you set this property to true and you have two documents with the same subject and you're mapping subject to the name of your document set, then we're going to just take the second one and rename it to, we'll put a 2 at the end of it to say, subject 2. And so we'll make sure if it's a unique notes document, it will remain a unique document set. With this property, you have some flexibility as to what you're going to lump into the same document set and what goes into a different document set. Now, either way, the first time we generate a new document set in SharePoint, that's when we set the header properties. So if you have the description if you're mapping some piece of notes data to the document set description, it's only when we first create that document set that we're going to set that description. If you have another document that maps that same document set, we're going to ignore the description on that one. So for all the header properties, it's the first one wins. And then for the subsequent documents, you can add additional members to the document set, and you can set the properties on those members, all the attachments that go inside the document set, but not the header properties. Now, remember I said that document sets are sort of like folders? Well, the rules in SharePoint are that document sets can be placed inside folders, but not the other way around. You can't have a folder within a document set, and you can't have another document set within a document set. So that's just a basic SharePoint restriction. So let's look at a couple examples, use cases for using document sets in a migration. So here's an example where we have a notes document, and this notes document has a few different data items, and it has a big rich text field with a couple attachments in it. And so what we're going to do is we're going to generate one document set in SharePoint with some of the properties mapped to the header of the document set, and we're also going to generate a rich text document inside the document set from that body field. So maybe we're going to take that big rich text body and generate a PDF document or a Word document or something like that, and then that also might have some properties that got mapped out of the notes document. And then we're going to take these individual attachments and we're going to map them as an individual file. So this doc set will have three members. One is our generated PDF document or Word document, and then these other two attachments. And by the way, these will remain linked. So this rich text document might have a link to the attachment, or you can set up property on this file so it links back to the parent document and things like that. You can still do all that. That works fine. The point is, one notes document has been resulted in one document set with all these parts in it. So that's kind of the one-to-one case. And the other case is where you're going to take multiple notes documents and merge them into one single document set. So in this case, when we migrate the first document, that's when we generate the document set. And so all the properties of the document set header come from whatever you mapped out of document one. And then we're going to take this rich text field and make that an element inside the document set just like before, and that will have properties that came out of this document. And then we might, for this, when the second document comes along, we can't map the header properties anymore, but we can still map content. So we're going to take this rich text body, map it into the document set as another, Word document or PDF document or whatever. And the properties on this one will come from the second document. Again, we can pick out the attachments and put them in the document set as well. So that's the many to one case where many notes documents become one document set. So with that, I want to take a look at some demos here. Let me share out my desktop. So I'll be using the Notes Migrator for SharePoint Designer client for most of these demos today. And I'm going to quickly just select my typical demo database, that document library that I use for most of my demos. And I'll just take the default source data definition. And on the SharePoint side, I want to select my site, and I'll just call this test doc sets. And let's say I wanted to generate Word documents in here. I'll make sure I create this library. And I'm going to load in a data definition for generating Word documents. So I've done this demo before where just with a standard document library and the target data definition for Word documents, we would automatically map all the properties to create a Word document where the rich text body was mapped into the Word document and all the attachments were mapped into an attachments area where these files live. So, but now I want to customize this job for Word documents. So I'm going to edit this data definition. And so in addition to that Word document column, I'm going to add a new column, and I'll just call this doc set. I can call it whatever I want. The most important part is that the type is document set. I'm going to do that one-to-one mapping, so I'm going to make sure I set this to true. I don't want accidentally two different documents that happen to have the same subject to get merged into one document set. And now I have this document set template, and this is something I can leave blank if I want to. If I don't have a custom document set, I just leave that blank and I can go forward. Or I could edit this, and if I wanted to, if on my server I had a custom document set. Okay, so I do actually have an Uber doc set and an advanced doc set. These are some custom document sets. So let's go ahead and load that. And if I load the fields from SharePoint, I can see that this custom document set has some extra fields defined. So these are additional things I can now map to in my migration job. So now I'll say OK. And now if I go to my Map Data tab, I can add a mapping to docset.name. That's the thing that's going to control the name of the document set. And let's map the subject field to document set.name. And I have these other properties I can map to. I can map to docset.description, map the category field to that. Let's just take the node ID and map that to doc.phone number. So let's go ahead and run this migration job now. And the thing we're doing here is we're taking the subject, we're using that as the name of the document set, and we're setting some other document set properties. Oh, one other thing I forgot. These attachments and objects are mapping to this files column. I want to make sure that my files column is no longer going to an alternate folder because I want all the files to be placed inside the document set. So I'm just going to remove that alternate folder, and so the files will be placed right in the document set. So let's go ahead and run this job. And I will go to the list. We created this document library, and you can see we have a bunch of document sets inside. So if I open the document set here for this migrated notes document, I should see that we have two things in here. We have the rich text document that I generated. That's the Word document. So this is similar to what I've showed you before for generating Word documents. Okay. And then we have the attachment. So this used to be an embedded OLE object and is now a Excel file that we extracted from the notes document. And I could have overridden the name of this document like I've shown you before. Okay, so that's the basic idea what document says. So I'm going to show you one variation here. Let's say that I wanted to not have unique document sets. Let's say I want to merge a bunch of documents into one document set. Let's turn off the unique by document ID property. And now let's, instead of mapping subject to the doc set name, I want to instead map, let's say the category to the document set name. So now I'm going to take all the documents with the same category and merge them into the same document set. So let's delete the prior contents and run this job one more time. I can just go to the list now. And so here's the document set for trees oak. And it's got multiple documents in here. It's got all these rich text documents that we generated, plus the attachments that went to the documents. And if I open the white oak, that should be the one that actually links to that attachment. Yep, so if I control click on this, it will just open that attachment out of that same doc set. Okay. Now our next topic is going to be generating pages. So in SharePoint, pages are usually ASPX pages internally. ASPX pages can be used for the design of the site. All the pages you use as you navigate around a site, those are ASPX pages, and you can edit those with SharePoint Designer. But you can also use ASPX pages for content pages. So this is where you go into a document library, you say create a page, and it might prompt you to create a Webpart page or a Wiki page. And these are pages that live in the document library. This is not the pages that make up your site structure, but these are pages in a library. Before SharePoint 2010, there was a lot of use of something called basic pages, and it was just sort of a really dumbed down Webpart page. These pages aren't used too much in SharePoint 2010, so I'll describe how to use them, but I won't focus on them that much. Much more common now in 2010 is what's called Wiki Pages, and it's sort of a more expanded, more powerful page type, and it's really nice for end users. They can create a simple page, it's just one big rich text page, and the editor is really nice. There's a good user interface for inserting attachments and images and so on. And I showed you an example of that a few weeks ago, but I'll dig into that a little bit more in just a minute. Also, there is something called Webpart Pages, which is a more powerful page where you can have a layout of Webpart zones. And here you can embed charts and controls and all sorts of things the way you want to. And we support generating Webpart pages. And then the high end is publishing pages. SharePoint has a few site templates that are kind of designed around the concept of publishing pages. They're sort of like Webpart pages conceptually, but they're more powerful. It has a clean separation of the layout that one person might design and the content that another person might design, and you can change the layout later without changing the content. And so it's really nice for publishing nice looking websites. And so the publishing solutions also typically have workflow in it for approving content to go live on a certain date and that kind of thing. So very powerful and very popular site template. And of course, we can generate publishing pages from your notes documents too. When migrating to any of these pages, a few reminders here. We've mentioned this stuff before. Images, attachments, and objects cannot be placed inside the page content. So you could populate a page with rich text content, but the images and objects have to live separately. And in fact, if you're editing a document in SharePoint, it will prompt you to upload your images and attachments to other document libraries on the site. And so we follow that model. We'll help you migrate images and attachments, and you would use that alternate library concept or the alternate folder concept that we've looked at in our tool to do that. And also there's an attachment links construct which you can put in your rich text area. The issue there is that notes documents usually have attachments as part of rich text fields. So in the rich text body, you have an icon where you can click on it and link over to the attachment. But sometimes notes have document level attachments which don't have a link from the rich text field. So if you're migrating the rich text field, and that's kind of the front end of your page, then how would the user ever get a link to all the other attachments? And so we have this attachments links area, which you can add to the end of your page, which will just give you links to all the document level attachments. So that's kind of a useful feature. If you have document level attachments and you want to migrate to a page, you'll probably want to append one of these at the end of your rich text field. So let's start with Wiki Pages. Wiki Pages, actually all of our pages, you start by creating a target column in your target data definition of type page name. And we call it page name because the thing you map to the page name is the piece of data that will control the name of the page that gets generated. So you map to page name and then you set a property for the page type. And so if you want a wiki page, you create a column of page name and you set the page type to wiki. Now there's also a property for controlling the extension of the file, but in every case I've ever seen, you just want to leave that to be .aspx. This will actually create the page, and then you think about migrating the content to that page. So you can add a column called wiki field, which is sort of the predefined name that's in every wiki page in SharePoint. And that needs to be set up as a type note, just like a rich text field would be in a list. You'd call that a note field in our tool. And then you can map your rich text content to that. If you want to, you can set other properties on these pages. You can set as many properties as you want. The wiki page is just one big rich text page, but if they were to go do view properties, they'd see these other metadata properties you mapped. And you can also use these metadata properties in views to organize your content and in search and things like that. So you can also map file columns to alternate libraries and folders like we talked about. You can also create folder columns. If you want to put your wiki files in subfolders, you can, just like we've shown you before, you can create folder columns and you can generate folder names from your notes data. The only required mappings are to map something to the page name column, which is this one up here, and whatever you map there becomes the name of the page. So if you map the subject field and the subject is test1234, then your page name will become test1234.aspx. And then you map the notes rich text column to the wiki field, which is this column right up here. Now, instead of setting up all these columns, what you're going to do most of the time is use our pre-built data definition, because we have a great data definition that has all this stuff set up for you. So you're probably going to want to start by using that. Basic pages are very similar. Again, you create a column of type page name, only this time you set the page type to basic. And the only difference is, instead of creating that wiki field, you set up a column of type Webpart property. Remember I said that basic pages are sort of a limited version of a Webpart page. So you define a column type Webpart property, and the title of that needs to be set to content, and the property name needs to be set to content as well. And so now you can just map to that content column for all your rich text data, and everything else is the same as we described before, including the fact that we have a nice pre-built data definition for you. Now with Webpart Pages, we're getting to something a little bit more complex. Webpart Pages are not just one predefined type of page, but every Webpart page might have its own custom layout and all that. So the way we handle that in our tool is you create a column of type page name and you set the page type property to template. And template means you supply the layout of the page as ASPX code. And so when you change the page type to template, there'll be a template property where you actually copy paste all the ASPX layout code right into our column definition. You would typically copy that from SharePoint Designer in this case. What you typically do is you create a Webpart page the way you want to in SharePoint, get it looking the way you want, and then go into SharePoint Designer and copy the ASPX code for that page layout and just copy it right into the template property. So pretty easy to do, But if you're not comfortable with looking at ASPX code, it'll probably be scary for you, but it's not that hard. In our migration job, you can then set specific Webpart property columns for every one of those columns you want to set from notes data. So you could have ASPX code hard-coded in the template property that has 6 web parts laid out, but then you're only going to dynamically map 2 of those. Maybe you're just going to map the rich text content and the title. And so for every column you want to map, you'd set up a Webpart property column, and then you configure that column with the title and property that matches what you described in your ASPX code, and then you can map to it. You could really send notes data to any property of any web part on that page. And so people have done some interesting things with that. Now, one particular web part that everyone likes is the content editor web part, and that's basically the core rich text editor in SharePoint. And so if you put a content editor web part on your page, we support that, and you can just map notes rich text data to that web part, and that works just fine. And everything else is the same. You can add additional properties that are just metadata in your library, as well as mapping the images and attachments to alternate folder locations or alternate libraries. Now, the required mapping here is you have to map, again, something to the page name column, which is this one up here. And then as many properties as you want to map, you can map over to these columns. Okay, and the last page type is publishing pages. And this is the one that a lot of people really use because it solves a lot of good problems and saves you a lot of development work. Because like I said, the SharePoint publishing templates are really nice. And so a lot of people like to think of putting their rich content into publishing pages because then they can benefit from designing the layout of the page once, and then they can generate a bunch of content publishing pages, and then they can go back later and redesign the layout, and then all those pages just pick up that new layout. So that's a pretty convenient thing. So publishing pages are pretty popular. Similar to Webpart pages, if you want a publishing page, you would create a page name column and set the page type of that column to template, and then again you got to paste the ASPX code of that publishing page into the template property. But don't use SharePoint Designer for this because SharePoint Designer can't actually see the part you need. The way to do this is to actually go into the web browser and download a copy of that ASPX page to your local disk, and I'll show you an example of this in a minute. And then look at that ASPX page, and then you can copy as much of that ASPX code as you want to keep into this template property. And then every time we generate a page in SharePoint, we will start by using this ASPX code for that page, and then you can also map any columns you want on top of that. Basically, any properties you want to map can be set using target columns. So when you look at this ASPX code, it'll define a lot of custom document properties, the title, the subject, and whatever properties you have on that particular page layout. And you have a choice of either hard coding them in the ASPX template, or you can map them dynamically in your migration job. So you might, for example, define a column called publishing page content, and you would set that as a notes column, and that happens to be for all the default SharePoint publishing pages. That's the name of the content area where you would put all the rich text content. And then one other important one is the publishing page layout. That's just a text column, and that is the layout name. So if you've used publishing pages, you've seen that publishing pages each have their own layout. So you need to get that layout name into your document, and you can either put that as a text column in your migration job and you can set that dynamically, or you could just hard code it into the ASPX page. Now, one thing to watch out for is this publishing page layout does have an absolute URL, and it needs to point to a page inside the same site. So that's one reason you wouldn't necessarily hard code it in the template. It might be easier for you to make it a dynamic column, and then for every site collection you're going to use this data definition in, you would just at a higher level set this layout. So hopefully this will become clear when I show you a demo of this. Now, the site templates that you get for publishing from SharePoint, they often assume that you're going to be putting your images and attachments into specific document libraries called an images library and a documents library. And your site template will already have these set up. So probably when you do your migration job, you're probably going to want to put all the images and attachments into these two libraries just so they'll be consistent with the new documents that users are going to create themselves. Now, you need to map something to the page name, just like with all the other pages I told you. So maybe you're going to map the subject field in Notes over to the page name or something like that. And then you have to map a valid publishing page layout string to this column, like I said, or you could hard code it in the template. Now, a couple other features of the publishing sites are approval process. So most publishing sites require document approval before the content goes live. And so if you want to, you can map something in Notes to approval code, and then you can control which documents are published and which are unpublished. If you leave this out, you might find, depending on which template you use, you might find that all the documents are unpublished and you have to go manually publish them all. So think about that, and you might want to just map either a dynamic variable or just a constant over to approval code to make sure everything goes in as approved. Also, some publishing solutions use specific content types, and so you might need to set the content type. The content type could be hard-coded in the template, or you could set them dynamically based on your notes data. So very powerful flexibility here, but it is one of the more complicated migrations you can do here. We certainly get plenty of support cases around getting publishing pages right. So hopefully, after watching today's demo, you'll know all about it and you won't have any problems. So before I go to demos, I just want to remind you of a feature we talked about way back in session 1 with render with form. And so you don't just have to settle for migrating the rich text field to a publishing page or a wiki page. You can also render the entire document, including all the form layout from the notes form. Go back and check out session 1 if you want to know more about how to do this, but just keep in mind it's not very hard and it's a good way for archiving your old content, is you can generate pages which preserve the layout and all the data that was on the original notes form. What I want to do now is I want to pick a different library name. Let's call it test wiki pages. And I'm going to just load in a predefined template that comes with Notes Migrator for SharePoint for Wiki Pages. It's our wiki target. And let's look at this data definition and we'll see what's in here. So not too surprisingly, there's a page name column, and that's of type page name, which is the important part. And the page type is set to wiki. So now we just map something to page name and we will create a wiki page. And then the content will be mostly in this wiki field, but we also have other properties. We have the title property here, which you can optionally map to. You don't really need that actually. You've got the wiki field. This predefined data definition has a folder you can map to if you want folders. And by default, our data definition puts all the attachments in a subfolder called attachments. But you can do whatever you want here. You can put this in an alternate library. You can change the name of this. But just for this demo, I'll keep the defaults. So all the files and images will go into this folder called _attachments. Okay, so my map data tab, I'll just take all the default mappings. And you can see that we're mapping subject to page name. And so the subject name in Notes will become the page name in SharePoint. We're also mapping that to the title property. And images and attachments and objects go into this files area. And then the rich text content will go to the wiki field. So let's just run this job without any further ado. So we're quickly generated a bunch of documents in here. Why don't I just go to this list right away while the job is still running. And so I've now got a bunch of wiki pages. I can open this Swamp White Oak page and you can see we have a wiki page. And again, the basic difference here between this and a list is this doesn't look like a form. We don't have all these form fields. It's just one big page. And so the user can edit this and they have a really nice rich text editor and so on. I'm going to show you a couple things and just to show you some variations here. For my notes data source, I'm going to load in, instead of the default data definition, I'm going to load in the source data definition for rendering documents. And so if I look at my map data here and redo the auto map, I can see that instead of mapping the body HTML, we're mapping the render HTML. So we're going to be mapping the full rendering of the data document to that wiki field. So it's actually very simple to do rendering, as you see. And this works with any notes application. Every notes document will be rendered with its default form. And then let's add one more mapping just to show off the folder property. Let's take the category field and map that to folder. And let's delete the prior contents and run this job. Okay, let's go to the list. And so here you can see in this library, we've got folders. So the category was trees slash oak was the category name. And so we created those subfolders, trees and then oak underneath that. And then the wiki pages are in those folders, and the wiki page displays now the original layout with its original notes form. And so this would be a good solution for archiving things once again. I'm going to now do a test of publishing pages. And so for this one, I'm going to select a different library. I've got a subsite, and in that publishing site, we have a pages library. So I'm going to select that, and then let's load in another data definition for page library. And that's actually a different one for 2010 and 2007. So I'm just going to load the 2010 version. I'm going to edit this data definition, and for the page name property, you can see we've set the page name property to template. And since I've set it to template, I've got to populate this page template property. It's a big text field where I would paste in all my ASPX code. So in order to get this code, let's actually go to the site. And so here's my publishing site, and there's no content in here other than the home page. And let's go to Site Actions, View All Content, and you can see we have a Pages library. We also have an Images library where we might put images, and Documents where we might put various attachments. So if I go into the Pages library, we only have one page. I'm going to actually create another page here. I can either do it here in the library, or I can go to Site Actions, New Page, and let's call this XYZ. Just give it a generic name. So let's create this page. And this is the publishing page editor in SharePoint 2010. So if I go to the page tab, I can do things like change the page layout, and there's a bunch of article pages, and depending on what template you deployed, you might have different layouts, and you might have developed your own layouts here. I'm just going to use one of the standard ones. Let's use the article page with summary links. So we're changing the page layout now, and I have this little summary links area and these other things I might populate. So let's just put in some sample data here. Let's put in a byline of A, B, C, D, and let's put in some page content, E, F, G, H, and let's add a link to the summary links area. Let's make that a link to the Quest website. And I can do anything I want to kind of set up my default page that's going to become the template of all my migrated pages. So I think that's good enough. Let's save that page. And I won't even bother to check it in because I'm going to blow it away anyway. So let me go back to my View All Site Content pages. So here's my new page, and I'm going to download this to my desktop. And I'll just take the default xyz.aspx. Let's go open that page now, and it will open now in SharePoint Designer. And so here is the markup for that page I downloaded. So this is not your usual ASPX page. Basically, it just specifies that it's a publishing page, and then it has in the page header, it has basically all the content for that page, but all the layout is over in the layout page. So I could either map the whole thing, or I could map different individual pieces. And if you're looking here, you can see there's the content type ID. I'm going to leave that hard coded in this document. The publishing contact, I'm going to clear that out because I don't want that in every document. And this publishing page content, this is the rich text field. I'm going to clear that out. Now, this is one of those important parts that I mentioned, the page layout. This is the string that gives you that particular layout. It's actually the name of the ASPX page that defines the layout is article links.aspx, but unfortunately it has to have this full server path. So this job will not be reusable in another site collection unless I change this. So I could decide to make this dynamic and override it in my migration job. For now, I'm just going to leave this be a constant. And a couple more pieces here. This summary links area, this is just the way the summary links area serializes its content. It serializes it XML. You can see that it has my quest.com link in there and so on. I'm just going to leave that the way it is. I want that hard coded in every page, so I'm just going to leave that there. This article byline, I want that to be a variable, so I'm going to delete that. So the title, same thing. The title is a variable, so let me delete that XYZ part. Okay, so let me now select this entire page content and copy that to the clipboard. And now I'm going to go back to my migration job, and I'm going to paste that in to my page template code. So delete the old one and paste in the new one. And so you can see now I've pasted in all that ASPX template code. And I could run this job right now without mapping anything, and it would just create a bunch of ASPX pages with that layout, but it wouldn't have much content, of course. The content part comes when I map things. So redo my auto map. So I need to map to my publishing page content, which was in my default job that I laid out. I want to add another mapping of, say, the category field to that field called article byline. And I've already got something mapping to the title. So subject is mapping to page name. That's generating the name of the page, the ASPX page. The title is mapping, and the rich text is being mapping to that publishing page content part. The category is migrating to the article byline section. Everything else is going to be hard-coded. All the other properties of that page is defined in the ASPX code, and so that's going to remain a constant. So let's go ahead and run this migration job. So now we're generating a bunch of publishing pages in that site. Let's go back to that list again. And you can see now that we've got these pages already created. And if I open this one, I can see we've now got a publishing page. It's got the byline in the little area where the byline is supposed to be displayed. It's got that hard-coded summary links area. It's a Quest link, so that will go to the Quest website. And the rich text field, of course, and the title. Now if I look at my show ribbon, look at my page properties, I can see all the properties that I mapped to in more detail. contact, the byline, and all that. Okay, so that's it for publishing pages. What you're going to probably do in production, your team might invent some additional layout pages, and you might have additional properties to map for that layout page, and then you would just define them the way I showed you. Okay, now we're getting to InfoPath. And when we're migrating documents to InfoPath, we are generating XML documents. So we're going to be creating InfoPath documents according to whatever XML schema you need us to create, and we're going to be publishing them into a InfoPath form library. So we support any InfoPath XML schema for the data documents, and that could be based on an InfoPath form template that you hand developed yourself in InfoPath Designer. And frankly, most of my customers, they still like to build their own InfoPath forms. Their InfoPath developers will build a nice InfoPath form, and then they use our tool to generate all the data documents. Or you could be using an InfoPath form template that you migrated from a notes form. So this is what I showed you a couple weeks ago in the design migration section, where we took a notes form and created a similar looking InfoPath form with the same layout and the same fields and all that. So the design migration is a separate issue. You may or may not have used our design migration features, but a lot of people use our data migration, our content migration features. So we have full support for generating basically any InfoPath schema you can come up with. We can map notes data to the desired XML elements, whatever XML fields you described in your schema, even if you've got a hierarchical schema with elements and sub-elements, we can put the data wherever you want us to. You might even have repeating elements. If your document has multiple categories, you might have defined category field to be a repeating field in your InfoPath schema. That's okay. We can take a multi-valued category field in notes and map that to your repeating XML table. We support the way InfoPath likes to handle rich text. Rich text is encoded as XHTML, and we support that. And that rich text could even have embedded images in it and doc links and so on. So we support all the features that you would expect from what the demos you've seen before, to work in InfoPath, and they do. For attachments, you actually have a choice. You can either encode attachments internally in the InfoPath document, or you can make them external, and we can give you links from the InfoPath document to the attachments that you put in some other document library. Now, we take all the documents that we generate and we check them into the target form library. And as you probably know, InfoPath and SharePoint have their own integration for exchanging properties between the InfoPath document itself and the form library that's containing all those InfoPath documents. So you can optionally map explicit SharePoint properties in the migration job, as you've seen many times already, or you can map all the properties just in the InfoPath document and leverage the automatic synchronizing of properties. You put in the InfoPath document, and then when we check it in, it automatically gets synced to a SharePoint property. So your choice as to which one of these you want to use. So when you're designing a migration job for InfoPath, what you need to do is add a target column in your target data definition of type InfoPath. And you'll use the template editor to import your custom InfoPath form template, and then you can describe which columns you want to map and where. So we'll automatically discover all the fields that we think are good mappable fields in your XML schema, but we'll let you override that. And you can do things like change the encoding options. So you might decide that one particular text field should be mapped as a common name out of your notes name instead of an abbreviated name, or it should be mapped as a date field. And our defaults are usually pretty good, but you'll have cases maybe where you want to change the encoding options. You can put in rules for how you want to handle missing notes items or multi-valued notes items. And it'll be simpler if I just show you this in a demonstration. And you can also put in the auto map hints, that auto map button that automatically knows which notes field gets mapped to which SharePoint field. You can put in the hints in our template editor, so the defaults will come out right for the next user who uses that data definition. And if you want to, you can override the published location of the InfoPath form. So when we generate a document, we put in a URL for where the form template lives. The XSN file is the form template. And sometimes the template that you imported doesn't really have the correct XSN location in it. So a common example of this is if you have published your InfoPath form to central administration as part of a solution, then it may not have the right XSN location name. And so there, in our template editor, we have a place where you can override the XSN location. And then the documents will open properly, pulling the form down from the right place. So now I want to take this notes database and I want to migrate it to an InfoPath form library. So I'm going to select my form library. So I already have a form library published. And actually, let's just go to that library right now. And so here's an InfoPath form library that already has some data in that, and I'll blow that away in a minute. Right now, let's go to the library settings, and I want to show you inside this library where the InfoPath form template lives. So I go into my advanced settings. I can see in my document template property, I can see the actual form template that's being used in this InfoPath library. So if I click on this and say save, I'm going to download that XSN file to my disk. And so it's just called template.xsn. Let's save that to my desktop. And I'll just open it now to show you what that looks like. So this is a form that we migrated previously, and you can see the form has a bunch of controls on it. I won't worry about the details too much, but the point is that there's an XML schema defined, and this really describes what the data document should look like. There's a subject field, there's a group of repeating categories. So categories is shown in a list box over here. And then there's an attachments area which has a group and then a repeat section and then the actual attachment, and that they're all living in this attachment area, in this repeating section of an attachment area here. So this is kind of the schema that we need to migrate to. So I'm going to close that. I'll go ahead and select that library, and I'm going to load a default data definition for InfoPath documents. Now this default data definition is not complete. You need to configure this a little bit. So let's edit this data definition for InfoPath. You can see here that we've got one column of it's called doc. It's of type InfoPath document. That's the important part. Doesn't matter what we called it, but the type is InfoPath document. And similar to what I showed you with doc sets, we have this special template which we need to customize for the InfoPath document. So I'll go into my editor here, and I can load in that XSN file that I downloaded from InfoPath. And we inspected that InfoPath template. We looked at the schema and we found all the columns that you might want to map to. So the ones with checkboxes here are the ones that we think you might want to map notes data to. But you could override this. You can say, I don't really want to map the notify after column or the review, these two columns. We can turn off the mappings we want. If I click on one of these, I can see some of the options for that mapping. So the subject field has no options on it. The review time field, if I was going to map that, I could have decided it wants to be encoded in different ways. It could be encoded as a date time or date only, or if it was a username, I could encode it as a common name or abbreviated name, or use the people picker control, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. Sometimes you might have a document. Sometimes you might have a case where you want to just hand generate the XML using a notes formula. So you could map a notes formula with just pure XML in it, in which case you just say I want to encode it as XML. And so it's up to you to kind of generate legal XML in your notes formula and then map it to this column. But I'll just leave that up for now. And I actually won't even migrate that column. The body field is of type XHTML, and we have some additional options for rich text fields. We can decide whether we want to generate link icons or include the images right inside the rich text. InfoPath actually allows you to encode images in the rich text body itself, and so these are both true by default. If I look at the categories field, that's the one that's a repeating field, and so by default we've set the multi-valued option to repeat, which means if I take a multi-valued piece of notes data, like a multi-valued category field, and map it to this, we're automatically going to repeat this XML tag for every element that we find. So if the categories field had 3 elements, we'd have this categories group in the XML document would end up with 3 category elements underneath it. Now we also have the if empty option. If empty, we set this to remove, and what that means is that we know that it would be illegal to have an empty category tag here. So what we want to do is, if there's no categories in the notes document, when we map it to here, we're actually going to remove the categories element completely, and we'll just have a categories group with nothing underneath it. And that's actually what you need to do in this case if you want to generate legal XML. But we set the default for you by looking at the schema. So again, normally you're going to just take our defaults. Now the attachments area has a similar issue. That's also a repeating section. It's actually more complicated than that. In the schema, there is a group, and then this container tag, body attachments repeat. That's just the way that schema named this element. But we're actually supposed to repeat this entire section for every attachment. So down here, we set multi to repeat parent. And what that means is we're going to repeat this whole section, this tag and this tag, for every attachment that we find. And again, we'll remove it if there's no attachments. So hopefully that gives you the idea that you can encode things the way you want to. You can control how multi-valued items are handled or empty items. Nillable means we actually set a property in this group to say nil equals true if nothing is mapped to that, if there's no value there. So that's just part of the XML schema that we need to comply with. And again, we just took all the defaults properly from the schema that we found. Now this is the part where we can override the location. So in rare cases, you will import the document and this will be blank, or it might be wrong. It might point to the wrong site. So actually, here's an example. You might put in the full distinguished name for your published XSN location. And in rare cases, you might actually want to get even more control. Now internally in our tool, we actually represent this entire set of stuff as XML, and this is actually the template for the document that we're going to generate. So the document that we're going to generate has this exact layout, except there's these tags in here, NMSP replace tags. These are basically just mapped to these things with the checkboxes here. And so there's very rare cases where we're not able to generate the document you want, and so you can just put in your own tag here to do something else that we didn't do automatically for you. So it's very, very rare that you would have to do this, but it is there if you need it. So let's just take this template the way it is now. And now when I go to my map data tab, if I want to add a mapping, I can see that I can map to all these different properties of my InfoPath document, .doc_subject, doc.body, and so on. Oops, I didn't mean to do that one. Let's see what my AutoMap gives us. AutoMap knows where most of this is coming from. It knows that subject maps to doc.subject, reviewer list, and all that. And that's because of those hints that were in the InfoPath document. So let's just take those defaults and go ahead and run this job. Delete the old documents, migrate some more. See, those are going very fast there. Let's go to the list. Edit one of these documents. And this, by the way, is this InfoPath form was designed for the InfoPath client rather than InfoPath form services. So it has to open in the rich client. And so InfoPath client opens up, it opens the document, and that subsequently downloads the form. The first time I access one of these documents, it downloads the form to the client from that XSN location. And then I'm now in the InfoPath client and I can um, set all these values and so on. But that's the idea with InfoPath. So a couple of advanced things I want to tell you about with InfoPath. One is how repeating groups would be handled. So if you see this, this is one of our customers' InfoPath schema. In their schema, they had an asset element defined, and in the asset they had multiple fields like the asset ID, asset description, and this was a repeating area where we had multiple assets in the assets group, and each one had multiple things in it. So before, what I showed you was category, where we had one category element that might repeat. Now we have multiple things that might repeat. And the trick there to doing that is you would simply leave them all as mappable, but you got to set each one to repeat parent. And if you don't do this consistently, then it won't work out for you. So you need to make sure you say repeat parent for each one of these, and then we will get, for every thing you map here, you will get the asset repeating. So let's say you mapped an ID column which had 4 values in it, and a description column that had 4 values in it, and a make column that had 4 values in it, and so on. Every one of these columns that you mapped from notes was an array that had 4 values in it, which is actually kind of common. We saw that a few weeks ago when we were looking at our normalization example. This will all work out fine. It will generate 4 assets in the assets section, and each one of them will have one of the elements from each of these columns. And so that's a way to kind of normalize the data properly into a complex rich text document like this. A couple of other things to keep in mind. I mentioned that people picker, you can map notes user fields like, who is this task assigned to, or other people data fields into the people picker control in InfoPath, but there are a few preliminary steps required in InfoPath Designer in order for this user mapping to work. I won't try to describe this in full detail now, but there is a document that describes how to do this. It's kind of tricky, but the document takes you through all the steps to do this. And this is on the SharePoint for All site, and I believe it's also on support link, so you can request that from support at Quest. Another issue is that you need to watch out for the version of the InfoPath form template, the XSN file that was actually published to SharePoint, and InfoPath XSN templates may be published to a list or library, or it may be part of a content type, or it may be published to an InfoPath library in central administration. And all these cases, when you go from InfoPath Designer and publish, it actually will change the form. So at a minimum, it might just increment the version number. Don't use the version on your client anymore. Download the fresh version from SharePoint, because the form might have been changed when you publish it to SharePoint. And so the best bet is to do what I showed you. Download the XSN from the final SharePoint location where, if you push into a content type and then push into a list, go grab the one at the final location in the list, and so on. Now, if you really are too lazy to do that and you know what the change is going to be, you could hand edit that XML, but really it's going to be safer to download the final version from the location. And then one other caveat here, we've seen a couple customers make this mistake. If you're mapping to a plain text field in InfoPath, don't try to set XHTML coding, because the migration job will succeed, but then you can't open the document later. If you've got some rich text, you better map it to a true rich text field in InfoPath. It'll let you get away with mapping it to plain text, but then it won't work when you try to open the document. And then the final reminder is you can also generate these InfoPath form templates like we discussed in session 5 in the design migration section, but the design migration is a different issue than the content migration. So the last topic for today is migrating to SQL Server. So why would we migrate something to SQL Server instead of just migrating it to a SharePoint list or a library or a page? Well, there's a few reasons that we've seen our customers employ, or a few reasons our customers have tried to do this. One is that they just have a really high volume of data record. They have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of records, and maybe this is something that's you know keeping that's logging events that happened in some system, and really this is the kind of thing that they don't really want to keep in SharePoint anymore. They would rather put this in a relational database just for the pure volume of documents. Even though SharePoint 2010 is pretty darn scalable now, they're still thinking that a relational database would be a better fit for that. A better reason is probably because they really want transactions. SharePoint doesn't support true transactions, so they would want to use a relational database so they can have transaction semantics and thereby keep their data integrity and so on. Now with SharePoint 2010, you can now use lookup fields to do cascaded deletes and things like that. You can get a lot of your data integrity that way, but it's still not the same as using a relational database transaction where you've got constraints and things like that. Another reason is that the data is needed by multiple applications other than SharePoint. So let's say you're running Microsoft Dynamics or some other system that wants to read data out of a relational database. That's a good reason to put it in SQL Server. Some people put data in SQL Server as kind of a stepping stone to migrate to some other system. They want to put it in a SQL Server database so then their developer can write a routine to push it off to Oracle or something like that. You could also use our XML file format like we described last week for that, but SQL Server is another choice. And then the final reason is that they don't have SharePoint deployed yet. Some people are on a deadline to get off of Notes as soon as possible, so they want to just dump everything to relational tables, and they'll figure out later how they're going to get it into SharePoint once they deploy SharePoint, 2 months from now. So we've seen all these cases with customers, and these are things that will drive people to migrate to SQL Server. Now, our feature for migrating to SQL Server is actually pretty powerful. We can populate just about any SQL Server table you have. We only populate existing SQL Server tables. We do not generate a SQL Server table. We can't take a notes database and kind of just spit out a SQL Server table with the right fields in it. You have to manually create the SQL Server table, and then we can migrate it. We also have some other limitations. We don't delete the prior contents like we do with SharePoint. It's up to you to go run a delete command on your server to kind of clear out the prior contents if you want to do that. And we don't detect duplicate documents. We don't have automatic renaming to make sure your names are duplicate, or we don't have versioning if you migrate the same document twice and things like that. No detection, nothing to do with duplicate document detection. Now we do support most column types in SQL Server. Certainly all the text columns and then date and number columns and so on, the binary Boolean columns. Now, if you want to migrate rich text, what people usually do is they would format that as HTML and put it in a big text column. Maybe an end text column with an unlimited size would be a good choice. And for binary columns, usually the image column type in SQL Server works out pretty well. So people do that, and we support the different ways you might want to set up keys in your relational table. So some people like to use an application data key like the employee number or the vendor code as your key in a table. So we can migrate notes data to the primary key, and we can watch out for duplicates and things like that there. We'll at least give you a nice error message if you've kind of tried to violate that and migrate something to a primary key that's not unique. We also support identity columns, so it's kind of common these days to not use application level keys for your primary key, but instead just have an auto number data column. So you use an identity column that just auto numbers 1 through infinity every time you add a record, and that's kind of done for you behind the scenes. You could actually decide to take some number in notes, like the notes ID, and map that to the identity column, or you can just let SQL Server number them for you, and we'll take care of the rest from there. we support some very interesting data normalization features. So we support one-to-many normalizations. So if you have a multi-valued item that you're migrating to SharePoint, you might want to blow that out into a separate table. So you create a one-to-many relationship between, we used the example of categories before. You could have multiple categories for every um, notes document you migrate, and you might want to normalize these into one-to-many um, table, two different tables in SQL Server with a one-to-many relationship there. We also Another case of that would be images and attachments. So let's say you wanted to migrate the binary files to a table that had an image column in it. That's fine, except you might have multiple attachments per notes document. So that would be a case where you'd want to normalize that out into a separate table with binary columns, and again, that would be a one-to-many relationship there, where we can write out the data and keep the normalization intact. And then we also support lookup columns. We also support lookup columns. And let's say you are migrating notes documents with the category field, and the same category is used over and over again in multiple documents. Like I've shown you, trees/oak was used in multiple documents. Instead of migrating the text value straight to the document, you might want to normalize that out to a categories table where you have tree/oak will only occur once, and then you'll join that with the data documents as appropriate. So I'll show you examples of these briefly. And we do also support all the link tracking and finalization that I've shown you in other examples. Now you're going to have to give the tool some extra hints, because we can't just create a link to a SQL Server document. So you got to tell us how you want to do that. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. So here's a simple example of some SQL tables that we created, just to give you an idea what this looks like. We took that document library and we've migrated all the notes documents to this documents table, and then we took all the images and attachments and we put it in this parts table. And so you can see this one document with the document ID of 2642 got blown out into these 4 attachments. You can see the doc ID here is 2642. So we've kind of maintained the integrity here. Here's kind of the architectural diagram here. The documents table has multiple, it's a one-to-many relationship with the parts table, and the doc ID field is a lookup into the documents table. And so we can just populate all these tables as we're migrating a notes document. Similarly, this category field, notice the category ID is just a number here, and that's pointing to the categories table where we've normalized out the unique category values. So the way you would create a SQL Server migration job is you'd go to our target tab, and instead of SharePoint, you're going to change the target type over to SQL Server. And then when you do that, your selection button will now select databases, and it selects from a predefined list of servers that you've configured in your tool options. So you got to first configure all your servers in the options, and then you can select databases every time you write a migration job. And then you create the target data definition where you specify the tables that you want to migrate, and you can load the schema from those tables into our tool, and you can set some properties that control how you want to map to those various columns, including what's a primary key column and which columns are used to control the normalization behavior that I described. And if you want to do linking to records, like if you want to use our link tracking service, or if you want to have the HTML in your parent document reference the images and attachments in that normalized table, you need to tell us how the links to those documents should be formed. So we can't just figure out what the URL is to a SQL Server record. We assume that you might have built some application that would display a record, and your application is going to have some URL format. And so you tell us what format you want to use, and now we can form a link to other documents for our link tracking service. or we can form links to images and attachments in an HTML section. And then the final piece is if you want to use our link redirector page, then you got to tell us where that redirector page lives. You can't deploy a redirector page on SQL Server, but you might have deployed it to some other SharePoint server, or you might have built your own redirector page, which is quite possible, and you just tell us the format of that redirector page. And so you got to give us some extra hints, and we'll create those URLs. Now, I'm running a risk of making this sound really, really complicated here. I want to clarify that very few people go to this level of detail of making links work. If you've got a lot of rich text documents with doc links, you're probably going to migrate that to you're probably going to migrate that to SharePoint. And SQL Server is probably going to be more for those text and numeric documents. So it's very rare that you really need to worry about links in your documents and so on in SQL Server. So this is only for really advanced use. Once we've migrated to SQL Server, of course, there are multiple ways you could bring this data back into SharePoint. So just because the data is in SQL Server, it doesn't mean you can't display it in SharePoint and edit it in SharePoint. So SharePoint 2010 has this thing called external list, which allows you to really easily take a SQL Server table and make it look like a list in SharePoint. And so it's, as far as the users are concerned, it's still SharePoint, but the data is really in SQL Server. So I wanted to point out that it's really still part of Notes Migrator for SharePoint here because even though the data is going to SQL Server, it's still part of a greater SharePoint solution in many cases. And we also have a set of web parts for those of you who've used Quest web parts. It's a really nice set of web parts for building fancy user interfaces in SharePoint. I mentioned that product a couple times. There's also a set of web parts for front-ending SQL Server data with more custom layouts and with custom forms and things like that, and kind of driving the application from the SQL Server data. So that's another way other than SQL and external lists for bringing in that external data back into SharePoint. Okay, so let's flip over to demos one last time here. So let me start by opening SQL Management Studio. So I've opened my server that I have on my machine here. Let's look at the databases there. And the database I want to target is this QDemo database. And this database has a bunch of tables here. And let's start by migrating to this documents flat table. So this is just going to be a simple flat database with a bunch of columns in it. A title column, which is text. A body column, which is also text. And category created by, created date. And parent ID. The document ID is the primary key, and this is set up as an identity column that's auto-numbered. So let's go ahead and migrate to this table now. What I want to do is go to my Target tab and change it from SharePoint to SQL Server. So notice the tab changes here to SQL Server. And a lot of things change in my migration job once I do that. So I can pick my server out of my list of SharePoint servers that I have in my options area. And actually, let's just quickly look at the options so you can see where I did that. There's a SQL Server tab, and we introduced this in version 6.0. And so if this wasn't already on, you need to have gone enable migration to SQL Server, and then you could set up your list of SQL servers that you want to connect to, and then you specify the authentication. I'm just using Windows authentication here, but you could specify SQL authentication if you wanted to. And here's where you would define for any documents that I migrate to SQL Server, I want to use the link tracking, and here's the URL that I want to use to point to documents in SQL Server. And so again, it's up to me to figure out where I want to put this ASPX page, and I just hard code this right here. And then the squiggle 0 part is where the notes ID goes. And so when we create links to this document, we will just use this redirector page. And I'm also turning on user mapping for SQL Server as well. Okay, so I've selected my server, and now we can select the database. So let's select that QDemo database, and it's right there. If I need to, I can test it to make sure I can connect to there using my credentials. Now let's create a target data definition for writing data into that database. So with my SQL Server target data definition, I need to specify my table that I'm going to migrate to, and I'll go to that documents flat table. Later I'll show you about normalized tables. We're going to keep it simple now. We're just going to go to that flat table, and then I'm going to add some data fields that describe how the data gets written out to the SQL Server table. Now I'm just going to load in the schema from that table, and that's really easy, and we do a really good job of getting all the defaults right almost every time. And so you can see the document ID column here is in fact an identity column, identity true. It's a primary key column, that's true, and it's of type integer. And similarly, the title column is a text field, variable character field, category field, same thing. And we looked at what's the required value in SQL Server, and we just extracted these things out of the schema. Now, created by is a text column in SQL Server, but here's a chance for me to kind of add some processing. Let's say I was migrating some notes name to this created by column, and I wanted it to be a Windows name instead of a notes name. If I say is Windows name, that's going to trigger our user mapping process. So we're going to go through that same user mapping process to convert all the notes names to Windows to Active Directory names, and we'll put them in SQL Server that way. For my date field, we detected that it's a date time field. And for the body field, we've detected that it's a text field, a really big one with unlimited size. And I know I'm going to be mapping HTML to this, so I'm going to have to manually say I want to consider this an HTML field. And that will trigger our fixup of HTML, fixup of links inside the HTML field for the attachments and the doc links and so on. So now if I press my auto map button, I can see that we don't have any automatic mappings because I didn't configure those. So I have to manually now add mapping of, say, the subject field to the title field and the category field to the category field in SQL Server, and the body HTML, the rich text version of the body field, over to the body field. And because this is not SharePoint, SQL Server doesn't automatically have this out-of-band metadata concept where SQL Server is just keeping track of the author and the created by date and all that. So if I want that, I can actually have columns that I added to my SQL Server table called created by or whatever. And so I'm going to just have to manually map the modified by to the created by field. And modified by is an array, by the way, so I'm going to take the default, which is the first field, but I can explicitly say first. If I wanted the last updated by, I would take the modified by array and take the last one. So in SharePoint, this was all automatic. We just did this behind the scenes if you just check the box that says you wanted this. But here you have to explicitly map these fields if you want that data in your SQL Server table. Let's add one more for the .created mapping to created date. And I could map something to the document ID if I want. Remember, document ID was an integer field, but I'm going to just leave that mapping out. And because it's an identity column, we're going to just let SQL Server auto number these records for us. So let's go ahead and run this migration job. And so what you'll find is that the writing to SQL Server part is really fast, but the reading from notes part is just as slow as it always was, at least in my environment. Okay, so my go-to button doesn't work. How do you go to SQL Server? That's not defined. So what I'll do is I'll just go back to my Management Studio, and I can say now, let's just edit the top 200 rows. And sure enough, there's all my data, and you can see that we've mapped the notes data, the title column, the category field. I mapped all my my notes names to Active Directory names like I wanted to. Map the date, and then the body field is a big rich text field, which um, is really actually pretty hard to see in SQL Server Management Studio. There's no easy way. I might be able to just copy paste this to some notepad or something, but it's a good time to plug, Toad for SQL Server. If you're a SQL Server developer, you might know the Quest product Toad for SQL Server. That product I don't have here, but it is really good at previewing the HTML here or extracting images and attachments, where in SQL Server Management Studio, it's kind of hard to do that kind of stuff and see what you generated, but that's just a limitation of the tool. We did auto number the document IDs, or SQL Server did that for us, and so on. And we did not map anything to the parent ID in this case. I could have. Okay, so that's a simple job. Now I don't really have time. We're already running over a little bit, so I don't really have time to do the full data normalization job. And what I want to do is just load an existing job that does that. And I'll just take you through this at a really high level. And then for those few people who really want to do data normalization, I'll point you to some more in-depth documentation for that. So let's just load an existing SQL Server job that I already have. And so if I look at my data definition here, it's just like the one I showed you before, except we're going to the documents table instead of the documents flat table. And then we're specifying normalization here. So the parts table is a one-to-many relationship. There's many attachments per notes document. And the categories field is a lookup table. And basically we're going to add related rows to this table if they're not already present. If they're already present, we'll just reference them. So in the data fields tab, you can see that we have the documents columns pretty much like I showed you. The difference is the category ID is an integer column. So instead of category, where we put the text of the category, this is an integer column. And this references a lookup table, categories. And the categories field is defined here. We got a categories ID, which is the primary key. And it's just another identity column of type integer. But the category field is where the actual categories go. And we have this property called isGatingField, and that's just kind of the control for our tool to know that this is the field that controls how many documents get written or when documents get written to this table. So basically, because categories is the gating field, we're going to look up and see if this category already exists. And if it does exist, we're going to just reference it. And if it doesn't exist, then we'll add another record to this table. So that's how the lookup process works. For the parts table, we have the primary key, which again is just, we have the document ID, and this is actually a lookup into the primary table. So document ID is a join basically to the doc ID in the document table. And then we have the parts column, where we're basically saying this is of type file, which means this is where the binary data is going to be written. And in addition to writing the binary data to the binary data column, we're also put the ID of the attachment or the image in this column, and we put the friendly name in this column. And so this is just a special construct in our tool, and our tool basically just does the right thing of putting all the documents. For every attachment, we'll create a record here, and it's a one-to-many relationship that joins to the main document. And we'll put the binary data unique key to the attachment within that document, and then the friendly name in these three columns. So I went kind of fast on that part, but like I said, you can go look at our detailed documentation on how to do data normalization. And if you get stuck, just come to Quest support and we'll help you out. So I'm just going to quickly run this job. Let's go back to Management Studio, and now let's look at the Documents table. And so here, once again, we've created documents and we've auto-numbered the documents. And instead of category, we have a category ID, and that would reference the categories table. So let's open the categories table. Maybe I can look at these side by side here. So notice that we have tree/oak is category ID 467, and you can find a bunch of documents that reference that category. And so we've kind of normalized out this, what used to be a repeating value, sorry, not a repeating value, but a value that occurred in multiple documents, we only store one time in our normalized table. And then if I look at our parts table, we have put all the binary data in this binary data column. And again, SQL Server Management Studio doesn't really let you look at this or extract it, but it's there. And your applications could get to this data. And the unique key is this part ID. And this is just a unique key that's stored inside notes for these parts. And what you'll find is that in most cases, the part ID will be equal to the friendly name. And this is just the way notes works. But in some cases, notes will uniqueify the part ID if you have two attachments with the same friendly name in the document. And then the document ID references the document ID here. So you can see this document is number 3990, and there was 3 attachments here. Some of these were embedded images in the rich text, and then here's the real attachment in this file here. So again, it would be up to you to create an application that displayed this rich text field and rendered all the parts in the, with the right URL according to the tags that you put inside this body field. So that's a really quick description of how to do the data normalization. So more details on that later. We're glad you were able to attend these 7 sessions of the Notes Migrator for SharePoint training. Definitely follow up with me if you want to. My URL is, my blog is here, and my email address was in all your invites. So feel free to contact me if you have any questions. And most important, if you're in some region of the world, remember that there's probably a Quest office not too far from you. So if your customer is in Germany, we encourage you to hook up with the German sales team and let them help you kind of win the business with your customer, and position both your migration skills as well as the product itself, and let us help you do a nice sexy demo of what their migrated applications can look like, and then together we'll win the business and we'll help you with the migration project.